can now speak to Chris Southworth, who is Secretary-General of the International Chamber of Commerce here in the UK. Great to see you, Chris. Thanks so much. Welcome back. I just want to ask you first, actually, about Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, in his emergency press conference today in London. I mean, he clearly said that the US approach threatening tariffs of 10% rising to 25% on these countries in Europe who've supported Denmark and Greenland, it was clearly wrong, but he seemed to be playing down the prospect of retaliatory tariffs on the United States if they are imposed. I mean, do you think that's the right approach? Can the UK not afford a stronger response at this stage to stand up to Trump's threats?
Yeah, it's not just the UK business, it's international business. I mean, I think it's really interesting listening to the UK Prime Minister today, you know, in comparison to EU Prime Ministers. You can understand the anguish coming from the Danish government, for example, France, and the EU in general. But I think what the UK were putting across today, and I think the Prime Minister was completely right, is none of us want a trade war. It's not in anyone's interest to have a trade war. We're talking about a region of the world which has never really been focused on up to now, but is opening up primarily because of climate change. You know, new shipping routes are opening up, access to oil and gas and minerals. That hasn't necessarily been possible before, but it's an area of the world that has joint interests that we haven't needed to think about before, and that's really interesting in many ways. And the Prime Minister was really setting out that we need to do this in partnership. Obviously, China, Russia, as well as Europe. It's not just all about the US. Canada also have a huge interest here in terms of the Commonwealth, with the UK and beyond. You know, we all need to work together and sort of set out the rules of how we engage in a new emerging part of the world that's opening up for trade. You know, the new shipping routes across the Arctic are going to dramatically change the shipping times from Asia to Europe and Asia to North America, not just the US. So, you know, this is a real opportunity. We don't need to get into a battle. I think that's what the Prime Minister was really saying. This is all about a partnership, less rhetoric, and let's just focus on pragmatic, practical solutions. I thought that was a really good message. Yeah. Is less bullishness. It's all about diplomacy, and don't sort of, you know, hit the panic button.
Well, in terms of that, Chris, I want to ask you about the European response. We heard Emmanuel Macron asking the EU to activate the bloc's so-called bazooka, the anti-coercion instrument in response to these tariff threats. I mean, that's a really serious weapon, isn't it, to deploy if the EU does decide to do it?
Yeah, the EU have serious muscle. So do Europe, for that matter. You know, if they really want to apply their muscle, you know, they've got, you know, not only the sort of so-called bazooka on trade tariffs, but they could limit access to US bases. The US cannot operate without Europe across the Middle East, Africa, certainly the Arctic, but also into Russia and Ukraine and elsewhere without the help of Europe. And let's not forget that. It's not a one-way show here. They could, you know, push the bazooka, they could limit access to bases, they could also limit access to funding for US military exports. You know, the US or EU buy 50% of US military exports. They don't need to do that. So there's some big levers to pull, but nobody wants to do that because we're all NATO partners. So I think the message today from the Prime Minister is let's be sensible. You know, this is a grown-up partnership that's well developed. We don't need to get into those kind of conversations. We need to be just diplomatic, not put economic pressure on each other, and find a pragmatic solution.
Chris, really appreciate your input. Thank you so much for that. Chris Southworth, Secretary-General of the International Chamber of Commerce in the UK. Many thanks.